Every crewed spacecraft America built for the moon race. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the ones that never carried anybody at all. 13 years separate a man folded into a capsule narrower than his own shoulders from a man standing on another world. And the machine that closed that gap was the flimsiest thing NASA ever flew. No lunar module ever failed with a crew aboard. How something that fragile ended up being the most reliable machine in the program is the part almost everyone gets wrong. I went through the reports on all 31 crewed flights America launched between 1961 and 1975, plus the 5 spacecraft that never carried anyone. Break one link in that chain, and nobody walks on the moon. It nearly broke 3 times. And the program you've been told won the moon race isn't the one that made it possible. That one flew in 1965, and it never went anywhere near the moon. America's first spacecraft wasn't designed, it was measured. The United States had exactly one rocket that could reach orbit, the Atlas, a nuclear missile. And that rocket lifted what it lifted. So the Mercury capsule wasn't built around the man, it was built around what was left over, 60 cubic feet. The astronauts said you didn't climb into a Mercury, you put it on. 120 controls and no computer. The math was done on the ground and read up to the pilot over the radio. It weighed less than a third of Gagarin's Vostok. That's the villain of this entire story, not engineering. Weight. Every pound you lift has to be pushed up there by fuel, and the fuel weighs something too. Physics doesn't negotiate. But the problem wasn't only what sat on top. Mercury flew on 2 different rockets. The Redstone, an Army missile, threw the capsule up on a 15-minute arc and dropped it back into the Atlantic. It didn't fly. It lobbed. The Atlas was something else. Stage and a half. It lit 3 engines on the ground and shed 2 of them on the way up. And to save weight, its tanks were so thin that the rocket only stood upright because it was pressurized from the inside. Take the pressure away and it crumpled like an empty can. That was what they were going to strap a man to. So they had to fatten it up, a thicker skin, purely to carry the weight of the capsule and the escape tower. It wasn't enough. Mercury Atlas 1 tore itself apart 59 seconds after liftoff. Before Mercury could carry a man, it had to learn how to save one. That job went to Little Joe, 8 flights from Wallops Island to test the escape tower. The first one went so wrong it's almost funny. August 1959. 31 minutes to launch and the escape rocket fires by itself, rips the capsule off the nose, and drops it 2,000 feet away. The Little Joe was still on the launcher, intact, decapitated. The cause? A ghost voltage in a relay. That was the debut of the system that would one day have to save an astronaut's life. And there's one more vehicle almost nobody talks about. Mercury Scout 1, a small satellite meant to prove the worldwide tracking network could actually see the capsule up there. Its rocket failed shortly after liftoff. They went anyway. Shepard, May of 1961. 15 minutes. Not even one orbit. A hop. Grissom. 11 weeks later. The flight was perfect. The trouble came while he was floating in the Atlantic, when the explosive hatch blew on its own. Water poured in, Grissom swam out with his suit filling up, and Liberty Bell 7 sank in 15,000 feet of water. For nearly 40 years the suggestion followed him that he'd fired it himself. In 1999 they pulled the capsule off the ocean floor, and the evidence backed his account. Grissom had been dead 32 years. The machine fails, the man improvises. That's the pattern for everything that follows. But nobody came closer to disaster than John Glenn. February 20th, 1962. America's first orbit. At the end of the first lap, a control jet clogs, and Glenn has to fly the spacecraft by hand, burning the fuel he needs to come home. And then, on the ground, a signal lights up. The clamp holding the heat shield has come loose, If that's true, the only thing pressing that shield against the capsule is the retro pack strapped over the top of it. And the retro pack is supposed to be jettisoned right before re-entry. Mission Control makes a call that was in nobody's manual: leave it on. Nobody fully explains why. Glenn works it out himself, and he comes down watching burning chunks tumble past the window, with no way of knowing whether they're his retro rockets or his heat shield coming apart. He splashed down alive. The shield had never come loose. The switch was faulty. The signal was false. 3 flights were left, and each one broke something different. Carpenter came down 250 miles off target, with his fuel gauge reading 6%. In fact, he had none left at all. Shira drifted through 6 orbits, hoarding propellant like a miser, and splashed down within half a mile of the carrier. And Cooper, the last one. 22 orbits. 34 hours inside 60 cubic feet. On the 21st lap, a short circuit kills the stabilization system. Cooper takes a grease pencil, draws reference lines on the window, lines the spacecraft up against the horizon by eye, times the burn on his wristwatch, and fires the retros by hand. He splashed down 4 miles from the ship. The most accurate landing of the whole program was flown by the man whose spacecraft had gone dark. 6 flights. A country that now knew how to reach space, survive a day up there, and come home. And nothing else. Because Mercury couldn't change its orbit, couldn't catch another spacecraft, couldn't dock, couldn't open its door, couldn't carry 2 men. Going to the moon needed all 5. But while those 6 men were becoming national heroes, another group of American pilots was training in secret to fly something completely different. Spacecraft with wings. Military spacecraft. Not one of them ever reached space. And the pilot assigned to the most ambitious of them all would become the first man to walk on the moon. In June 1958, the Air Force picked 9 men to become the first astronauts in history. The list still exists, and it's sorted by body weight, because the rocket couldn't lift any more than that. The program was called Man in Space Soonest. It died on August 1st, 1958, the day America decided its crewed spaceflight would be civilian, and created NASA. Of those 9 men, only 2 ever reached space. One of them was Neil Armstrong. The other was Joe Walker, and he didn't need a capsule. He needed an airplane. The X-15 didn't take off. A B-52 dropped it at 45,000 feet, and from there it lit a rocket engine. 199 flights. 13 of them went above 50 miles, the altitude the Air Force counted as space, and 8 pilots earned astronaut wings for it. But only 2 flights ever crossed the Kármán line, the real 100-kilometer boundary. The same man flew both of them, a month apart. Joe Walker, 67 miles up. It's still the ceiling for any piloted airplane in history. And even so, the X-15 was not an orbital spacecraft. It went up, and it came back down. Without orbital velocity, there is no orbit, and without orbit, there is no moon. NASA, meanwhile, refused to give astronaut wings to a civilian pilot. Walker finally got his in 2005. He had been dead for 39 years. But the real loss was something else. The X-20 Dinosaur was a Boeing spaceplane. It would ride a Titan into orbit, maneuver up there like a satellite, and land on a runway at Edwards like any other aircraft. 7 pilots were assigned to it. One of them, again, was Armstrong. On December 10, 1963, McNamara killed it. $400 million spent. The drawings nearly finished, and his reasoning was brutal. The Air Force had obsessed over how to come down, and had never explained what the Dinosaur was going to do once it got up there, because something better was already on the shop floor. Cheaper, more capable, and with no wings at all. A capsule for 2 men. They called it Gemini, and in 20 months it did the 5 things Mercury couldn't. Change orbit, catch another spacecraft, dock with it, open the door and climb out, and stay up there for 2 weeks. All 5 are mandatory to reach the moon. Not one of them had ever been done. To lift a capsule twice the weight, NASA reached for another missile, the Titan II. 2 stages and hypergolic propellants. Chemicals that ignite the instant they touch each other. No spark, no igniter. Fewer parts, fewer things to fail. But the Titan had a vice. As it burned, the pressure in its plumbing hit resonance, and the whole rocket started bouncing vertically, up and down, like a spring. They called it pogo, and the forces it generated were enough to knock an astronaut unconscious. The Air Force refused to help fix it. Pogo didn't affect their nuclear missile, and solving it would delay their program. So NASA had to tame it alone. Standpipes in the oxidizer, higher pressure in the tanks, a mechanical damper on the fuel line. They put a spring on the spring. On March 23, 1965, Gus Grissom went back to space. His last capsule had sunk in the Atlantic, so he named this one Molly Brown, after the musical about the woman who wouldn't sink. Nobody at NASA found it funny, but that day, Grissom and John Young did something no human being had ever done. They lit an engine in orbit and changed where they were going. That's where the road to the moon begins. Not in 1969. 3 months later, Ed White opened the hatch of Gemini 4 and climbed out. 20 minutes floating above California with a compressed gas gun in his hand. When they ordered him back in, he called it the saddest moment of his life. Then the hatch refused to close, and the 2 men had to wrestle it shut by hand, in vacuum, with their gloves swollen stiff by the pressure. And that was the easy part. A year later, Gene Cernan climbed out of Gemini 9 to test a rocket backpack. His pressurized suit went rigid, like armor. His umbilical shoved him wherever it wanted. Every movement cost 3 times the effort it had in the simulator, and his cooling system couldn't keep up. His heart rate went past 180. His visor fogged over on the inside. He went blind. At 17,000 miles an hour. He felt his way back to the hatch, rubbing the glass with the tip of his nose to clear a hole small enough to see through. Going outside wasn't floating. It was fighting. Then there was the problem of finding each other. Because in orbit, speeding up to catch someone lifts you into a higher orbit, and a higher orbit makes you slower. Instinct is useless. You have to do the opposite of what your gut says. December 1965. Gemini. 7 has been circling the planet for 11 days when Gemini 6A launches to chase it. Shira closes the gap over 4 hours, braking with his head instead of his hands until he stops 1 foot away. 2 spacecraft, flying in formation, at 17,000 miles an hour. 1 thing left, touching. March 16, 1966. Armstrong and Scott docked Gemini, 8 to an Agena rocket, the first docking in history. 27 minutes later, the stack starts to roll. They think it's the Agena. They undock, and the moment they do, with the rocket's mass no longer holding them back, the Gemini takes off. 1 full rotation per second. Their vision blurs. Their eyes start twitching on their own. A little more, and they black out. The failure wasn't the Agena. A short circuit had jammed thruster number 8 open on their own spacecraft. Armstrong shuts down the entire maneuvering system and lights the re-entry thrusters. The ones you only touch at the end of the flight. He stops the spin, and he burns 75% of that fuel doing it. So, the mission is over. They splashed down that same night in the Pacific. One problem was still unsolved. Nobody knew how to work outside a spacecraft. Buzz Aldrin fixed it on the final mission in November of 1966. He trained underwater to fake weightlessness and covered the outside of the capsule in handholds and foot restraints. 5.5 hours outside, never broke a sweat. 12 missions, 2 uncrewed, 10 with men aboard. In 20 months, America went from knowing nothing to everything. And while NASA was doing all this in the open, the Air Force was building its own Gemini. Identical from the outside, with a hole cut through the heat shield. It was called Gemini B. and from the outside, it was almost identical. On the inside, it had a circular hole cut through the middle of the heat shield. That sounds insane, because it is. The heat shield is the only thing standing between the crew and 3,000 degrees. The Air Force punched a hole in it, fitted a hatch, and planned to have its astronauts crawl through it into a laboratory mounted directly behind the capsule, without ever going outside. A laboratory for what? Officially science. In reality, a spy telescope with a 6-foot primary mirror pointed at the Soviet Union. They called it Dorian, and the whole stack, the manned orbiting laboratory. On November 3, 1966, they tested it. They took the re-entry module from Gemini 2, which had already flown 11 months earlier, and launched it again. It was the only American vehicle built to carry people that ever flew twice before the space shuttle. The hatch in the heat shield survived re-entry, and melted itself shut. Permanently. 17 men were selected to fly it. One of them, Robert Lawrence, was the first black astronaut ever selected. He died flying an F-104 without ever leaving the atmosphere. On June 10, 1969, Nixon killed MOL. Over $1 billion. Not one crewed flight. Automated spy satellites were already doing the job better, cheaper, and without putting anyone up there. 7 of those pilots transferred to NASA. Every one of them eventually flew. 12 years later, on the space shuttle, Blue Gemini and Big G, a stretch Gemini for 9 people, had already died on paper before them. The 2-man capsule was finished. Because down in Houston, the spacecraft that was actually going to the moon was already built, and it was about to kill 3 men without ever leaving the ground. The spacecraft that went to the moon was built in 2 versions, and mixing them up is the most common mistake made in telling this story. Block 1 and Block 2. Block 1 could not go to the moon. It never could. No docking probe, no transfer tunnel. There was no physical way to attach it to a lunar module. It was a test article for Earth orbit and nothing else. And it had a 3-piece hatch. The inner one opened inward, held shut by the cabin's own pressure. Under ideal conditions, with everything perfect, it took 90 seconds to get out. If the cabin was overpressurized, it could not be opened at all. January 27, 1967. Launch Complex 34. Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee have been sealed inside a Block 1 for hours running a countdown rehearsal. The cabin is filled with pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch, higher pressure than the air outside. In an atmosphere like that, Velcro burns. Aluminum burns. At 6:31 in the evening, someone says there is a fire in the cockpit. The review board could never determine where the spark came from, most likely an electrical arc in a chafed wire. It does not matter. What the board did establish with terrible clarity was everything else. A sealed cabin, pure oxygen, combustible material everywhere, and no way out. The fire drove the pressure up until the hull ruptured. They died of asphyxiation in under a minute. When the wreckage was taken apart, they found a wrench socket inside, left behind by somebody months earlier. Ed White had been the first American to walk in space. Gus Grissom had been the second American to reach it. Grissom had spent 6 years insisting that his hatch on Liberty Bell 7 had failed on its own. He died trapped behind another hatch that would not open. And here is one of those things people get wrong. That flight was not called Apollo 1. It was called AS-204. The crew had fought to give it a real name. After the fire, the widows asked for one thing, that no one else be given that number, that their husbands keep the flight they never got to fly. On April 24, 1967, NASA made it official. AS-204 would be recorded permanently as Apollo 1. Which raised a question, what do you call the next one? There was talk of renaming the 3 earlier uncrewed flights backwards, turning them into Apollo 1A, Apollo 2, and Apollo 3. It never happened. So the next Apollo mission was number 4, and that is the entire explanation. There is no Apollo 2, there is no Apollo 3, there never were. They were not lost, hidden, or failed. NASA simply refused to invent missions to paper over a gap. The gap is the memorial. Out of the ashes came Block 2, a single-piece hatch opening outward 3 seconds, 9,000 pounds lighter, and finally a probe and a tunnel to dock with the Lunar Module. No crew ever flew a Block 1 again. They came back with 3 flights carrying nobody. Apollo 4, the first time a Saturn V ever roared. Apollo 5, which tested the Lunar Module and launched on the very rocket that was supposed to carry Grissom. And Apollo 6, which nearly tore itself apart. Then 11 crewed missions in 4 years. Apollo 7, the first. Apollo 8, which circled the moon with no lunar module aboard and read from Genesis on Christmas Eve. Apollo 9 and 10, the rehearsals. And 11 through 17, 6 landings, -1. April 13, 1970. An oxygen tank in the service module explodes 200,000 miles from home. The cause traces back to a piece of paperwork. That tank's thermostat was designed for 28 volts. In 1965, NASA raised the allowable heater voltage to 65. Nobody told the company that made the switch. Weeks before launch on the ground, that heater ran for 8 hours at 65 volts. The thermostat welded itself open. The wiring cooked from the inside, and the insulation was destroyed, invisible, waiting. A memo nobody sent. That's what nearly killed 3 men. And none of these spacecraft would have gone anywhere on their own. They were lifted by the largest rocket ever built, which on its second flight very nearly destroyed itself. The Apollo program didn't use 1 rocket. It used 4. The smallest was the Little Joe 2. No guidance, no glory. Fired off from White Sands 5 times with a single job. Proved the escape tower could rip the capsule off the stack if everything went to hell. The same idea as Mercury's Little Joe 10 years later. Nobody remembers it. And without it, nobody flies. Then there was the Saturn I. It flew 10 times and never carried anyone, because it couldn't. It didn't have the muscle to lift even a half-fueled service module. The one that did carry men was the Saturn 1B. 9 flights. It launched Apollo 7, all 3 Skylab crews, and the last Apollo mission ever flown. The workhorse. And then there was the other one. 363 feet, 5 F1 engines at the base, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen at a rate that's still hard to accept. 13 flights between 1967 and 1973, and not one of them failed to complete its mission. But that record hides one very ugly morning. April 4th, 1968. The second Saturn V. Empty. 2 minutes in, the first stage hits resonance and the entire rocket starts bouncing. Pogo. Again. 30 seconds of it, tearing panels off the structure. Then the second stage lights, and halfway through the burn, engine number 2 shuts itself down. A second later, so does number 3. 2 out of 5. Dead. The guidance system was never programmed for that. It improvised, burning the surviving 3 almost a minute longer to compensate. The rocket made it up. Crooked, but it made it. And then the third stage refused to relight. If Apollo 6 had carried a crew, those men would have felt the pogo in their bones, reached the wrong orbit, and gone nowhere at all. 18 months later, that same rocket put 12 men on a course for the moon. The pogo, incidentally, never entirely went away. On the way up, Apollo 13's center second stage engine quit 2 minutes early. Nobody remembers it because what happened 2 days later was worse. 15 Saturn V's were built. 13 flew. The other 2 are still lying on their sides in America. They never lit an engine. NASA ran out of missions before it ran out of rockets. And all of this, 3,000 tons of fire and steel, existed to put one single thing on the moon. A 4-ton machine with walls thin enough to punch through with a screwdriver. That could not even fly on Earth. It is the only spacecraft in American history that could not fly on Earth. That is not a figure of speech. The Lunar Module was structurally and aerodynamically incapable of flying through our atmosphere. Drop it from an airplane and it does not glide, it does not fall with dignity, it comes apart. It was built to operate in vacuum and nowhere else, which makes it technically the first true spacecraft human beings ever made. Everything else in this video was a capsule, a thing designed to survive coming home. Not this one. This one never had to survive anything. So Grumman was free to take absolutely everything off it. They took out the seats. The crew flew standing up, shoulder to shoulder, strapped in place because a seat weighs something, and on the moon you do not need one. They took out the big windows because glass weighs something. What was left were two tiny triangles angled downward about the size of a sheet of paper. They deleted the second docking port, and then they started shaving the hull. Tom Kelly, the chief designer of the lunar module at Grumman, put it this way. In places, if you were not careful and you dropped a screwdriver, you could punch straight through the skin of the spacecraft. Now, be careful here, because this is where almost everyone overshoots. That shiny foil you can see on the outside is not the hull. It is thermal blanketing and micrometeoroid protection. Underneath it is real aluminum structure, and it was strong enough to hold the pressure difference between a breathable cabin and absolute vacuum. It was not a tin can. It was something stranger. A machine stripped of everything that was not strictly required to keep two men alive. And it first flew in January 1968 without legs. The first lunar module launched with no landing gear at all, because all they were testing were the engines. The next one was Snoopy. Apollo 10 came down to within 9 miles of the lunar surface. Stafford and Cernan were close enough to pick out craters the size of a house. And they could not land. Snoopy was an early lunar module, too heavy, built from the start as a test article. Its ascent stage was not even fully fueled. Cernan said it bluntly years later. If they had tried to go down, they could not have gotten back up. And then during staging, a couple of switches in the wrong position sent Snoopy tumbling out of control above the surface of the moon. Stafford grabbed it by hand and wrestled it straight. Cernan swore, live, on NASA's radio loop. 2 months later, one of these went all the way down. July 20th, 1969. 3 minutes from touchdown, the Eagle's computer starts throwing an alarm, 1202. It was not a failure. It was the computer saying it had more work than it could fit into one cycle. The rendezvous radar had been left on, and it was eating 13% of the processor. And here's the part nobody tells. The software Margaret Hamilton's team had written was built for exactly this. When it overloaded, it threw the low-priority jobs overboard, restarted itself, and kept flying the spacecraft. 4 1202s and 11201 in 4 minutes. And the Eagle never once lost track of where it was. Armstrong took manual control, flew past a boulder field, and set it down. He had about 25 seconds of fuel left. 9 months later, the same design did something it was never meant to do. Apollo 13's lunar module was rated to keep 2 men alive for 45 hours. It kept 3 men alive for 90. Its descent engine replaced the dead engine on the service module and pushed them home. Its batteries powered the entire stack and recharged the command module for re-entry. The temperature inside dropped below 40 degrees. They drank less than a glass of water a day. And then the carbon dioxide started climbing. The filters from the command module were square. The openings in the lunar module were round. In Houston, a team of engineers dumped onto a table exactly what was aboard: a plastic bag, a piece of cardboard, duct tape, a sock, and built an adapter out of it. Then they read the instructions up to 3 freezing men 200,000 miles away. It worked. The last 3 missions flew a stretched lunar module, with more supplies, able to stay 3 days on the surface and carrying an electric rover folded flat against its side. 10 lunar modules flew. 6 of them landed, and not one ever in the entire history of the program failed with a crew aboard. The most fragile thing America ever built was the only one that never let anybody down. The leftover hardware didn't go in the trash. In 1973, NASA took an empty Saturn rocket stage, hollowed it out, fitted it with bunks and windows, and launched it on the last Saturn V that ever flew. They called it Skylab. 63 seconds after liftoff, the protective shield tore off the hull, ripped away one solar panel, and left the other one jammed shut. The station reached orbit half dead and cooking from the inside. 3 crews went up to fix it, in Apollo capsules, on Saturn YB rockets. They rigged a parasol for shade and freed the stuck panel by hand with a pry bar in vacuum. One of them stayed up there for 84 days. And in July 1975, one last Apollo command module launched to dock with a Soviet spacecraft. The 2 vehicles were incompatible, different atmospheres, different hardware, so a third module had to be built just to sit between them. It was the final flight of a CSM, and the last time a Saturn ever lit an engine. 6 lunar modules landed. Not one came home. 4 ascent stages were smashed back into the moon on purpose, so the seismometers the astronauts had just set up could listen to the impact. One was abandoned in lunar orbit, and a 2021 study argues it may still be circling up there, empty, right now. And the only lunar module still intact in space never landed at all. Apollo 10's Snoopy is somewhere in orbit around the Sun, and nobody knows exactly where. But you just heard me say the giant rocket isn't the one that won the race. There's a devastating case against that. The Saturn V flew 13 times and never failed to complete a mission. And that perfect record hides 13 separate emergencies. One of them was struck by lightning, twice, in the same minute. And 2 more were built that nobody ever lit. Every launch explained. It's on screen now.